First, I want to thank Roger for filling in while I was down in Lomita last week, speaking on their lectureship. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I want to, won't take too long to recognize where we are, though, since it's been a couple of weeks. This is the second portion of the first big part. The first part of 1 Corinthians is about dealing with two issues that were told to the Apostle Paul by the household of Chloe. And that is, the first one had to do with their division problem, but the second had to do with a problem of morality, and that's what we're seeing here in chapter 5. When you get to chapter 7, he is going to begin answering a series of questions that they had, and that constitutes most of the rest of the book. So here we are in chapter 5, dealing with the problem of immorality that is taken hold in the congregation, in which a man is taking his father's wife. And this was something in an immoral city like Corinth in that day was even unheard of there. And so he draws their attention to this, about how bad it is, and their attitude toward it, which was to kind of think, look how, how accepting, how loving we are, and we're good with all this, and we're a different kind of people. And he is onto them and says, hold on here, what are you thinking? This is completely wrong, and I've already made a judgment about this. There's no question about what ought to be done. This is wrong, and it needs to be treated as sin. The correct answer then again is found verses 6 through 8, as he introduced the problem in verses 1 through 5. In 6 through 8, here's what needs to be done, is that there needs to be action needs to be taken. You need to make a distinction here and purge out that leaven. That is, you get the influence out, you get away. He's already said the reasons why, and this is important before we move in to the last section of the chapter, is that you need to address this problem for that person's good first. That's in verse 5. That person needs to be turned over to the world, to Satan. Why? Because they've reached a point, they're so far out there, is that it's got to be the consequences now that bring them back, because they're not listening to the gospel. So you need to be turned over to the consequences and let them feel their consequences of their sin. But second of all, is you need to realize how it's affecting you, and that you have an obligation to the congregation to remain pure and to not have that influence affect you, and also to recognize that in the future, anything that you accept now, and you're proud about how tolerant you are, is only going to bring everything down spiritually, so that you are being accepting of sin, and therefore, in the end, the implication is you won't be spiritual at all, because you're going to be so accepting of sin that will be your identity. You won't be what God wants you to be anymore. So that was the situation. And so now as we move in, leaving what we saw there in verse 8, as he closed that off, and we looked at the nature of these words of the contrast between malice, wickedness, and sincerity and truth, and getting down to what their attitudes were. Okay, and now we're going to move into his clarification on dealing with some misunderstanding perhaps that they'd had on this, and he doesn't understand how he's basically saying, I don't know how you possibly could have misunderstood me, but you did. So we're going to clarify that right now, and after an interaction online yesterday, I entirely understand why he might want to clarify. So y'all that didn't see that, good. Now everyone's going to go check. Don't do that. Okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 9. I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with sexually immoral people of this world, or the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. We'll stop right there. Okay, wanted to go both those verses so we understand where the confusion was. Paul had told them, you do not need to, in the translation here, keep company with. The word there is very interesting, because it's the idea of what you would do with putting something in a drink, like they would. It's to be, don't get mixed up with. Okay? So the idea of being part and parcel with, the whole idea of you put something in there, you are now just part of it. You're no longer distinct. So you don't get mixed up with or be part of what they're doing. Okay? So that idea of keeping company with, within the wording, is stronger because it's talking about the influence he just mentioned. So when he says this, do not keep company with, he has in mind the leaven illustration he just left. So if we separate it out, we forget about what he had just said, we lose sight of the full impact of what he is saying by command here and what he had told them. That's why he used that example. So he says, I did not tell you not to keep company with sexual, when he says this and wrote an epistle, we're going to come back to that in a moment, not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Okay, so he had told them, but he says, but what did he actually mean by that? Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of the world. So he had told them, look, you are not to be mixed up with those who are sexually immoral. Now, the word there is more specific than that. This is, again, with your King James, this is fornicators. Okay? So generally we talk about that, and the only reason I want to make sure we understand the difference here is he's very much talking about those who are involved in sexual practices that are immoral. Okay? And it is not just those things that are just as sinful but are lascivious in nature, that appeal to the lust. This is the relationships, activity. Okay? And that's what he's dealing with here. Now I want to back up, though, to the very first thing he said as we move into this. He says, I wrote to you in my epistle. Now this is, correct me if I'm wrong, 1 Corinthians. He hasn't yet said, to my knowledge, in this book, don't keep company with sexually immoral people. And what good would that have done to tell them here and then to come back to it, because this is the letter. He's already had this discussion. There's apparently a letter that preceded this one, in which he specified this in particular. Now that tells us something. It says that this was a problem. And it makes sense when you go back and look at Corinth at this time. Again, you're dealing with a city that was wealthy. It was a commercial city, a lot of commerce, a lot of back and forth, a lot of business going on, but also a long history of what most people would think, very progressive thinking about morality and society. So what they would look at, and they had with their religions, were very much toned toward the immoral practices, including to the idea of, as we mentioned before, having prostitutes associated with cults and being part and parcel of being religious. That's the background. So he has already told them that. Now, you can understand, I'm going through all that so you understand why they might be confused when he says, don't be mixed up with, keep company with sexually immoral people. Well, you're in a city where that is very prevalent. It's all over the place. Okay, well, I don't want to have anything to do with them then. Okay, we'll do that. He says, that's not actually really what we're talking about here. It's because of the idea of being mixed up with has to do with a social relationship of that ties you to the other person in a stronger way. That's what we see in verse 10 that he's clarifying. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. Okay, here's the point of clarity that he needed to make. Is that you have, when he was telling them this, that relationship was wrong. It was not that you didn't have any interaction with people of the world that were involved in these sins. And that's why he adds in this other list of sins. How would that even be possible is really what he is getting to. How are you going to just live in the world and have no interaction with anybody who's participating in these things? Any interaction. Okay? You're going to go and have your list of questions you ask when you order pizza? Is that what you're going to do? What's the basis of the relationship at that point? It's just a business kind of relationship, right? Okay, how many of y'all are just, you can build relationships with people. You go and they wait on you regularly, right? People do that. It's doable. But that's not the core of that relationship. Y'all are awake, right? Okay, I have to check every once in a while. Paco? He's going to, not exactly, but of course he does get there in 2 Corinthians, so I would say there is a relationship to that idea, to what he's saying here, is that he is wanting to make sure they understand that you're going to interact with people in the world. Okay? He's wanting them to understand there's no way to get around interacting with the people in the world. But you cannot teach people if you're not interacting with them in some way. You can't reach out to someone who's lost if you're not willing to be part of their lives in some way, but that's a different type of relationship. And so your point about the unequally yoked, I think, is valid when it comes to that, to understand there's a difference. What he is pointing out in the context, and we don't know the context in which he wrote this, but he's clarifying it for their benefit, is when I'm talking about being mixed up together, okay, that tight-knit kind of interchange of a social companionship, I'm talking about that your relationship as a congregation, you do not need, as part of the mixture, a fornicator. That should not be part of the basic mixture. Now, if you think about this, a congregation is essentially, as a whole, the putting everybody's talents, personalities as a whole, interactions all together, and it's how all of that works together that gives the congregation a personality. I feel like I've really lost you for some reason, and I'm not trying to. John. Yes, to a degree. He's actually taking it down to its core elements of where, before you ever get to fellowship, in a sense. He has fellowship, and this goes back to what Paco said, is that before you ever get to there, you have to consider who should be in, okay? And so he is going through and saying, look, there are going to be these problems in the world. That's why he comes back in chapter 6 and says, such were some of you. So he says, when I was talking to you, he says, it should have been implied I was talking about this should not happen within your midst. And that core element is exactly what they had ignored that he talks about as the problem in verse 1. He says, in other words, I already wrote to you about this problem, that you do not need to have any kind of interacting with as a congregation that is accepting of this kind of behavior. And yet here you are. That's his big point. That's why he brings up the fact that he already wrote to them about it. He's tying that in and saying, I already wrote about this, and I guess that you took it to mean you shouldn't have anything to do with the sexually immoral people that are not Christians, because you're fine with all the sexually immoral people who are Christians. He says, that's totally messed up. That's the implication. He says, what are you thinking? Why would we be fine to have it inside, but we're going to stay with it away from those nasty sinner people on the outside, when we're the sinner people on the inside? That doesn't make any sense. And that's what he's getting to. Now, what creates that kind of justification? What thinking, get into the heads of the Corinthians a little bit, what kind of thinking gets you there to where you're going to stay away from it with all the people in the world, but you're going to condone it within your own midst? Oh, you are so on target right now. That is exactly what we tend to do, is we think people know, and they should. That's actually where he's getting with all this, is they ought to know. And we do love them. And so we end up in this situation of thinking that time and what? Just attendance? Right, okay, good. Familiarity, companionship, all this, just being here in this magical atmosphere, that does the trick. No, we don't actually say that out loud, but that's how we behave. Okay, Devin.
I feel like there's also going to not be a sense of like doing the easy thing in both scenarios. Like even though it's easy to not go out for the world, it's also easy to not address it in the brethren.
Good. That is correct. Okay. Yes, we will do the easy. We will. It's easy to hole ourselves up in here, and this is the holy place. So we don't have to deal with the problem in here because this is, everything's fine. Because we're all perfect people, right?
Yeah, and there's another thing. You know, we all have like things that we all do that nobody knows about. So
How do I judge? Yeah, so we don't want to be judgmental. So the whole idea, which is very prevalent in the religious world, of not being judgmental, and that's a reason why that word judge is going to come up. It already has in this chapter. It's going to come up again. And I think for similar reasons. It's easy to exclude people who aren't even here. That's one of the easiest things in the world. Yeah, we don't have anything to do with those people that don't show up. They're kind of self-selecting, right? But it's harder to actually deal with it inside. And so we take the easy route, and then we justify it by convincing ourselves we're doing it because we're so loving, that we're just patient, all those kind of things. When the question is, and there is a right way, that we need to be loving, we need to be patient, but then I want to know what your plan is. What are you doing to address it? If you don't have something, a plan to address it, you are not being patient and you're not being loving, you're being tolerant and you're overlooking. If you don't have a plan that is specific action that we're addressing something is going on, then you don't get the benefit of these other kind of positive characteristics. Okay? Those are spiritual things that imply other things are going on to try to get it better and address it. They were not doing that. Okay, Tracy.
It could also be a misunderstanding of forgiveness and not forgiving the way God does. God always requires repentance.
Okay.
He expects us to do so.
Okay. Tracy says that maybe they misunderstood forgiveness, and that they're just very forgiving people, and they're gracious, and so we're going to show them grace. Okay, but God's grace does not sit there and just do nothing when sin is there. Okay, it addresses the sin and calls for the sin to be changed, repented of, so that there can be correction, so there can be fellowship. Okay, so.
Somebody else is responsible to take care of that. I'm not the one.
Okay, good. Yeah, we get into it, and it's always the someone else problem. And what we're going to see, if you notice what we went over last week or 2 weeks ago in 6 and 8, it is not a someone else. It is every one of us is supposed to be involved in this if it's going to work. To correctly address a problem of sin within takes everybody recognizing it for what it is and addressing it appropriately with a firm understanding of that it is sin and understanding that's unacceptable and being willing to change how you see that person and how that person realizes they're seen. That's the power of do not be mixed up together with. Keep company with. You see, immediately he's saying something about our social behavior has to change. They have to note they're already different spiritually, right? And they haven't recognized that, which is why they're needing to be handed over to Satan. What are we doing in the acknowledgement of that? We're trying to show some distance emotionally, socially, so that they can understand the distance that already exists spiritually. That's the problem, is that they are oblivious to this. I mean, to be fair, everyone in Corinth was apparently oblivious to this at the moment. None of them recognized that this was a problem. The first step was Paul coming in and getting the congregation to understand it's a problem and to see it through God's eyes, so that then they can address it with the hope that the persons involved, that they will start seeing their own behavior through God's eyes. But all of that is very hard. We don't ever talk about church discipline with the idea of it being easy. We don't talk about it a whole lot. We tend to oversimplify it and act like we can just kind of, who's on the roster, who's not church discipline. What announcement is made from the pulpit, that's not itself church discipline. That's a reflection of everything else going on. It's a communal effort to reestablish and reconnect a soul with God that has wandered. That's its purpose. But there's a correct process to it well. And we have to have our mindset right, that to recognize the sin problem, and that sin is a problem in this person's life. So we'll address the sin in that person's life. Notice the extent he built out upon this, and we'll just quickly think about through all these people. The sexually immoral, is that a problem today? Understand that it's getting, last time I checked the figures, out of wedlock births are surpassing those in wedlock births. Now, there's nothing wrong with the baby. There's a lot wrong with that behavior. Covetous. I always like to point out that this is one list and all of these are treated as problems that have to be addressed. Covetous. Well, where does that come in? What is covetousness anyway? Greed? Okay. Somewhat, there's a little bit of jealousy, and the core idea, though, is the constant desire for more. Okay, a little bit of that. But, okay, it doesn't even have to be that so much as there's something I don't have that I want, so what's at the core of this is a lack of contentment. Now, let me illustrate this, and I won't apply to everybody, but it's the latest, greatest problem, and technology is just replete with these kind of examples. My computer is fine until the next model comes out, and I realize something's better. And then I need the computer. No, I don't. Car, right? Had this great, I've got a fantastic, I bragged about it when I got it, showed it off and everything. Next year rolls around, we got another model. Mine doesn't have that. Okay, so I wanted us to understand this is a hard issue, and it can be a very small thing. It doesn't have to be the amount of the money involved so much as the heart of the thinking, convince ourselves that we need things. Extortioners. This is, it's an interesting word because it has the idea of what you can get your hands on. It's like you can grab. It's an idea of what you can get within your grasp. Okay. There's specifically money, dishonesty combined. find out a way to get it out of somebody else. You know, I know something about Roger. Try to get some money out of him. Extortioners. That wouldn't happen? I know one. I know one who was arrested. Mm-hmm. Yep. Elders, preachers, you got to watch those two types. Right? Their problems. Okay. What happens there? No, this is a side issue. Because we somehow, we think that's why the qualifications matter so much, is that you're dealing with character that is immovable despite being put in situations where you need to have more things that could go wrong, more things at your disposal. You know, a lot of men have never had a money problem because they've never had any money. Okay, now they're in charge of money. You don't know how they're going to react to it necessarily, except for other things. Okay, it's all of those kind of problems that we're considering. Yeah, we don't think about it, but also you're thinking about Christians. These are fairly new Christians they came out, for most of them, they would have come out of a what's wrong. The idea of right and wrong is being pretty malleable. And we're getting in a society in which, you know, whatever. We can justify just about anything. So if you have to work on those kind of things, we're trying to teach those people old habits can die hard. This is part of where they were dealing with, is you're falling into these problems. You know, the sexually immoral, I mean, I've mentioned before, but the number of preachers I've known who've fallen victim to this sin, again, because of the lack of direct oversight over their day-to-day activities, possibly being part of the problem. It's a problem. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we're somehow above these problems because we worship together or we hear about it all the time. That doesn't mean we're actually dealing with it internally. And that's kind of where Paul is getting them, is trying to understand you have to deal with these things. That's not the kind of book that 1 Corinthians is itself, because he's having to deal with so much stuff that's just out there right up front in terms of problems, even the questions themselves. But he is trying to get back to the core issues to get them to address that. Idolaters. This is directly what they would have come out of. False religion. How quickly do you put away your false religious ideas when you obey the gospel? Isn't that a process? You don't just flip a switch, come up out of the water and I'm free from my sin and all my wrong ideas. That's not how it happens. We have to expunge those. Okay? All of these behaviors and thoughts we have to get out, or they will come back and create problems for us again. It's an active, ongoing process to get them out of there. Okay, now he's still talking about then, since you would have to go out of the world. You would need to go out of the world if you're going to avoid those people entirely. Can't be done. That's not what I was talking about. So verse 11, but now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother. That is, let me explain, there's a certain scope I had in context there. That you have a different kind of responsibility and a different relationship with your brethren than you have with someone in the world. Why, and what's the basis for it? What's the basis for that difference? Because we need to highlight it. Obviously, well, we're Christians. Yes. What changed that then means that that relationship is by its nature different and has to be treated very differently in regard to addressing sin? Because that's what the context is. He says when you become a Christian, how the sin in your life needs to be addressed is very different than when you're not a Christian, as far as what the responsibilities you have to them are. That's the distinction he's drawing here, is that you're not going to be able to avoid the people in the world, but there's something you're going to need to do and change within when people are involved in sin. So there are specific differences in how we have to address fellow Christians. Why is that the case? Okay. Okay, good. You're both right. Okay, I'm going to start with Tracy's, then we'll get back to yours, Bill. The idea is there's a greater responsibility, you're a reflection when you've taken on the name of Christ. By being baptized in and becoming a Christian, the responsibilities you accepted of discipleship go way up. It's the difference between people who have had nothing to do with the covenant and those who said, I'm all into the covenant. I'm accepting of this. This is why we have to make sure that when we're teaching people, they understand the responsibilities. It's not just the benefits. It's not just you're going to be saved, you're going to be freed from your sins, you're going to be forgiven. You are also a Christian who is a disciple who is stating by your repentance and your confession and your baptism that you are prepared to do whatever Jesus wants you to do. That's what we're supposed to be getting to. Now, it doesn't, again, even with that preparation, it doesn't get there overnight, because you don't realize up front all the things you have to change a lot of times when you don't realize everything. You know, you have your list. I know I'm wrong on this. We try to cover some things in the Bible studies. Okay, but there are going to be some more things to come that you're going to have to work on. And get out that maybe you didn't realize, or temptations you haven't had yet that you're going to have to address. Okay, that's right. And in doing these decisions, though, the nature of it changes because you become a Christian. It's about Christ. It's about the church. And you've said so. You have made it so. And so when you become a Christian, the responsibilities you take on and the accountability you accept is far greater. That's the implication here. Roger? Yes. Yeah, the closeness ought to be there. That this ought to matter to me more. But it reflects. That goes back to reflecting on the family a little bit, and how do you bringing this in? Now we're having to deal with all this, and are we just going to ignore it, or are we going to say this? Are we going to love people enough to say this is unacceptable? Yes. I was going to use an example, but I feel it could go off the rails, so I'm not going to. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Okay, good. James chapter 5, 19 and 20. I'll also throw in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. That we are as a congregation, as the Lord's church, we're all about saving souls. And we should be about saving the lost, but then let's coin a term. Sometimes you have to resave people. They were saved at one time, and they've let sin get back into their lives, and they need the same kind of attention on them. But there should be more to deal with. When you obey the gospel, you now have a background in knowing what God expects. You have accepted the authority of Christ. You've accepted the nature of the church. You've accepted the nature of repentance, of commitment in confession, and that what you are to obey comes from God. You've accepted at some time in your life all those things. So there's more expected of you. And that is the basis upon which we ought to be able to go to people. Now, understand, I think I said this when we started this, is that a lot of times these people are feeling hurt in different ways too. Your kids will act out sometimes when they feel hurt in some way. It sometimes had nothing to do with anything directly related to it. That's just how they're feeling. Adults will do that too and not understand that's what's going on. So that's where the patience come in. That is, it's in the way we address the sin. We're addressing it, but we have to realize we've got to take the time, and we're going to have to deal with a lot of negativity coming our way sometimes, more so from those who've fallen away sometimes than from those who've never obeyed the gospel, because maybe they were hurt by somebody in the church. Those are tough. Those are real. And guess what? That means there's something else we have to address. But going back to the whole point, if we're loving souls, and we are all about souls. So his whole activity here of what he is identifying is to get them to the soul level. That's what they've lost out on. We have to dig beyond just the obvious of the personal level, the social level, we get used to things, right? And we stop looking for problems. We assume everything's okay. And we've got to be looking at souls as souls and doing that. And that's kind of where he was getting them back to, is that you're not seeing the soul problem here. And you're not seeing these distinctions here from a soul basis. So when he says this, and he's going to go back over his list again, and then he's going to add something. Sexually immoral, covetous, idolater, reviler, or drunkard, or an extortioner. And you got the sins of the tongue, and then the inability of controlling the will that had to do with the drunkenness, which was, again, that one was often tied to the concept of, with various idolatrous practices, pagan practices as well, and that's why that was such a problem. The alcohol itself that they had was not nearly as strong as what is available today. We perfected the practice of losing our minds. But theirs was not as strong. It took a lot more. And actually in the Roman Empire, with their wine, they actually wanted that. They wanted to be able to extend the time where it was just what people called a buzz, not to get drunk. That's how much that's their idea. So that's when you get the idea of the wine bibbing and sitting long a drink. That's why. Okay? We've got a little bit of a different problem because of like binge drinking, those kind of things. But in each one of these, you've got the problem of you're not in control of your soul. You're not in control of your decisions. You're not thinking about, with what you're doing, you're not thinking spiritually about what your actions are. Okay? But then he says, we don't have time to go into this because we'll work this in as we finish the chapter next week. It doesn't bother me because it's good discussion. Not even to eat with such a person. Now he's tied two things together here. The first is not to be mixed up together with, and then the other was not to eat with. Those are related, because he's talking about you have to change your social behaviors with people for them to get the point when they're in sin. Remember, what he's trying to get them to do is to strip things down so that they see where they are in their soul. And you don't do that by simply berating people. That is actually an excuse, and many times it doesn't. Now, you're going to bring this up. That's not what I'm talking about. You're going to talk about it. I'm talking about the idea of just the constant yelling, lecturing kind of approach. Because that makes it too much about us. I'm sorry. It is a calm explanation of where they are. Explaining why I have to change my behavior around you. We can't do some of the same things we used to do together. I'd love to, but I can't. Because I don't want you thinking you're okay. And when we get into understanding the finer points of family, and because it gets really tricky when you're dealing with, okay, well, now you got someone who is in the sin problem, but there's a marriage going on. What do you do with the husband's the problem, the wife's the congregation? Okay, those are the tricky situations you still have to deal with that have to fit this model, okay, for what he's getting to. We'll pick up there, and we'll talk more beginning next week. Not every spiritual conversation is fun. Those are probably the most needed.